In the early 20th century, the world was changing at an extraordinary speed. Railways connected cities, factories transformed economies, and enormous ocean liners crossed the Atlantic carrying thousands of passengers between Europe and North America. For millions of people, the Atlantic Ocean represented opportunity. For immigrants, it was the route to a new life. For wealthy travelers, it was a symbol of luxury. For businessmen, it was a highway connecting two continents. And for shipping companies, it was a battlefield. The most powerful companies competed to build larger, faster, and more luxurious ships than their rivals. Among them was the British shipping company White Star Line. White Star Line wanted to challenge its greatest competitor, the Cunard Line, which operated famous ships such as Lusitania and Mauretania. But White Star Line chose a different strategy. Instead of focusing primarily on speed, the company wanted to build enormous ships that would provide unmatched comfort, luxury, and reliability. This vision eventually produced three extraordinary vessels: Olympic, Titanic, and later Britannic. They were known as the Olympic-class liners. The second of these ships would become the most famous ocean liner in history. Her name was RMS Titanic. Construction of Titanic began in 1909 at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Ireland. At the time, Belfast was one of the world's greatest shipbuilding centers. Thousands of workers participated in the construction. The scale of the project was enormous. Titanic was approximately 882 and 9 inches long, making her one of the largest moving objects ever created by humans at that time. She was nearly as long as several city blocks. Her hull towered above the water. Her massive engines were designed to produce enormous power. Inside the ship were dining rooms, lounges, cabins, staircases, kitchens, elevators, swimming facilities, and other amenities that would have been unimaginable on ordinary ships. Titanic was not simply transportation. She was designed to be a floating palace. Her designers paid extraordinary attention to detail. First-class passengers could enjoy elegant dining rooms decorated with expensive furniture and beautiful woodwork. There were private suites, reading rooms, smoking rooms, a gymnasium, a swimming pool, a Turkish bath, even a squash court. The ship had electric lighting and advanced systems for its time. Passengers could dine on elaborate meals prepared by professional chefs. The first-class experience was intended to resemble staying in one of Europe's finest hotels. But Titanic was not built only for the wealthy. The ship also carried hundreds of second- and third-class passengers. Many third-class passengers were immigrants traveling to the United States and Canada. For them, the voyage was not a luxury holiday. It was the beginning of a new life. They carried suitcases filled with clothing, family possessions, letters, photographs, and dreams of the future. Some were leaving poverty behind. Others were joining relatives who had already settled in North America. Some hoped to find jobs. Others simply wanted a safer and more prosperous future. These passengers came from many different countries and backgrounds. They spoke different languages, they practiced different traditions, but they were all traveling aboard the same ship toward the same destination. Titanic's designers also focused heavily on safety. The ship was divided into 16 major watertight compartments. These compartments were separated by watertight doors. The idea was simple. If one part of the ship was damaged, the doors could be closed and prevent water from spreading throughout the vessel. Titanic could remain afloat with several compartments flooded. This design gave engineers confidence in the ship's survivability. However, there was a major limitation. The watertight bulkheads did not extend completely to the top of the ship. If water entered enough compartments, it could eventually spill over from one compartment into another. Titanic also carried lifeboats, but there were not enough lifeboat spaces for everyone aboard. This was partly because maritime regulations at the time were based on a ship's tonnage rather than the number of passengers it carried. Titanic actually carried more lifeboat capacity than legally required, but the total number of lifeboats was still far below what would be needed to evacuate every person. This decision would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the disaster. As construction progressed, Titanic became a symbol of human engineering. Newspapers described the ship with excitement. People were fascinated by its size, its luxury, its technology, its power. Some promotional language surrounding the ship suggested that Titanic was exceptionally safe. Over time, this contributed to the famous idea that Titanic had been called unsinkable. The reality is more complicated. There was no official technical declaration that Titanic literally could not sink, but the ship's design and reputation created an enormous public perception of safety. Many people believed that modern engineering had made a disaster almost impossible. In May 1911, Titanic was launched from the shipyard. Thousands of spectators gathered to watch the enormous hull enter the water. The launch itself lasted only a short time, but it represented years of engineering and labor. Afterward, Titanic was fitted out. Her engines were installed. Her interiors were completed. Cabins were furnished. Electrical systems were tested. Navigation equipment was prepared. Thousands of workers contributed to the final stages. Finally, Titanic was ready for sea trials. On April 2, 1912, the ship underwent testing in the waters around Belfast. Engineers tested her speed, steering, stopping ability, and other systems. The trials were successful. Titanic was officially ready for service. Her first voyage would begin from Southampton, England, with planned stops at Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown, Ireland, before crossing the Atlantic toward New York City. On April 10, 1912, Titanic arrived at Southampton. The harbor was crowded. Passengers gathered at the terminal. Port workers loaded luggage. Crew members prepared cabins. Mail was brought aboard. Food and supplies were loaded. The atmosphere was filled with excitement. For many passengers, this was the beginning of an unforgettable adventure. For others, it was the beginning of a completely new life. Among the passengers were some of the wealthiest people in the world. One of them was John Jacob Astor IV, an American millionaire and member of the famous Astor family. Another was Benjamin Guggenheim, a wealthy businessman. There was also Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's, traveling with his wife Ida. But Titanic also carried people whose names would never appear in newspapers: workers, immigrants, families, children, teachers, engineers, servants, musicians. Each passenger had a different reason for making the journey. The ship's captain was Edward Smith, one of the most experienced captains in the White Star Line. Smith was widely respected. He had spent decades at sea. Titanic's officers included experienced navigators who understood the challenges of Atlantic crossings. Among them was First Officer William Murdoch and Second Officer Charles Lightoller. The ship also carried a wireless telegraph system operated by radio operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. This technology was still relatively new. Passengers could send private messages across the ocean. The wireless operators could also communicate with other ships. This would later become critically important. As Titanic prepared to depart Southampton, thousands of people gathered to watch. At approximately 12 noon, Titanic began her maiden voyage. The enormous ship slowly moved away from the dock. Tugs helped guide her into open water. Passengers stood on deck waving goodbye. Families on shore watched the ship disappear toward the horizon. Nobody knew that Titanic would never return to Southampton. The first part of the voyage was relatively uneventful. Titanic traveled toward France. At Cherbourg, the ship stopped to collect additional passengers. Because the harbor was not deep enough for Titanic to enter directly, smaller tender boats transported passengers between the ship and shore. More travelers boarded. Among them were wealthy Americans returning home. European immigrants continued their journey toward North America. Later that evening, Titanic sailed toward Ireland. She reached Queenstown, now known as Cobh, on April 11th. Here, more passengers boarded. Mail was loaded. Some passengers who had been staying in Europe said their final goodbyes to friends and family. Titanic then turned westward. The vast Atlantic Ocean stretched before her. The ship had thousands of miles to travel before reaching New York. For the passengers, the voyage appeared to be progressing normally. The dining rooms were busy. People walked along the decks. Children played. Passengers wrote letters. Others enjoyed meals and conversations. The first-class passengers experienced luxury unlike anything available on most ships. Second-class passengers enjoyed comfortable accommodations that were considered excellent for the period. Third-class passengers lived in more basic conditions but were still part of an extraordinary journey. Meanwhile, Titanic's crew worked continuously. Engineers monitored the engines, firemen shoveled coal, stewards served passengers, navigators monitored the ship's position, wireless operators sent and received messages. The ship functioned like a small floating city. Every day, thousands of individual tasks had to be completed. Titanic continued westward. But as she entered the North Atlantic, the crew began receiving messages that would become increasingly important. Other ships were reporting ice. Large icebergs had been observed along the shipping route. At the time, ice warnings were not unusual. Ships regularly crossed areas where ice could be encountered during spring. Captains were expected to remain alert and adjust their course when necessary. Titanic received several warnings from other ships. Some messages were taken seriously, others were treated as routine information. The ship continued at a relatively high speed. The weather remained calm. The sea was unusually smooth. The sky was clear. There was little wind. For passengers on deck, the night appeared beautiful. But calm conditions could make icebergs harder to detect. Without waves breaking against an iceberg, there could be little white foam around its base. The darkness made the situation even more difficult. On the evening of April 14th, Titanic continued through the North Atlantic. Lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee stood high in the crow's nest, scanning the dark horizon. Did they have binoculars? In the historical record, the crow's nest lookouts did not have binoculars that night, though the exact circumstances and equipment have been discussed extensively. Their task was simple but extremely important. Watch the sea, look for ice, report anything unusual. The ship continued forward. Inside, passengers enjoyed their evening. Some were eating, some were talking, some were sleeping. Some were preparing for the next day's arrival in New York. Nobody knew how close the ship was to disaster. Then, at approximately 11:40 p.m., Frederick Fleet saw something ahead. A dark shape appeared in the distance. It was an iceberg. Fleet immediately sounded the warning bell. He called down to the bridge, "Iceberg, right ahead." The officers reacted. The ship began turning, but Titanic was traveling through the darkness at significant speed. The iceberg was already dangerously close. The next few seconds would change maritime history forever. The great ship had encountered the obstacle that would begin the final chapter of her maiden voyage. And as Titanic turned in the darkness, the sound of metal meeting ice traveled through the enormous vessel. The disaster had begun. By the time Titanic struck the iceberg, most of the passengers had no idea that anything serious had happened. The collision occurred at approximately 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912. From inside the ship, the impact did not feel like the dramatic crash people might imagine today. Some passengers felt a vibration. Others heard a strange scraping sound. A few barely noticed anything at all. But beneath the surface, the situation was rapidly becoming catastrophic. The iceberg had damaged the ship's hull along its starboard side. Water began entering several compartments. Titanic's designers had expected the ship to survive certain types of damage, but the extent and pattern of the flooding were beyond what the vessel could withstand. The ship's chief designer, Thomas Andrews, quickly inspected the damage. He realized something terrifying. Titanic was going to sink. Captain Edward Smith was informed. The realization was devastating. The ship was considered one of the most advanced ocean liners in the world. Now, less than 3 hours after the collision, its fate had already been decided. But the passengers did not yet know. At first, many people remained calm. Some had returned to their cabins. Others were still in dining rooms and lounges. The crew began preparing for an emergency evacuation. The Titanic carried more than 2,200 people, including passengers and crew. There were not enough lifeboat seats for everyone. The crew therefore faced an impossible task. They had to evacuate thousands of people using a limited number of lifeboats. The first lifeboats were prepared. Passengers were instructed to put on life jackets and move toward the boat deck. Many people did not understand the seriousness of the situation. After all, Titanic was still brightly illuminated. The engines were operating. The ship remained mostly level. There was little visible panic. Some passengers even believed the lifeboats were being launched only as a precaution. The first lifeboat, lifeboat number 7, was lowered at approximately 12:45 a.m. It had capacity for significantly more people than were actually placed aboard. Only around 24 passengers entered. This became one of the tragic problems of the evacuation. The crew had never conducted a full emergency evacuation drill. Many passengers hesitated to leave the safety of the ship for a small wooden lifeboat sitting on a dark, freezing ocean. Some believed Titanic was safer. Others did not want to separate from family members. Some simply did not understand what was happening. As the minutes passed, more lifeboats were launched. The evacuation became increasingly serious. Women and children were generally given priority, but the implementation varied from boat to boat. Some lifeboats left with empty seats. This meant that hundreds of potential places for survivors were lost. The sea temperature was close to freezing. Anyone who entered the water would have only a limited amount of time before suffering severe hypothermia. The wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, were working desperately. They transmitted distress messages to nearby ships. The most famous signal was CQD. This was one of the distress signals used before SOS became universally dominant. They also transmitted SOS. Titanic's wireless operators contacted nearby ships. One of the closest was the RMS Carpathia. Captain Arthur Rostron ordered Carpathia to turn around and race toward Titanic. But Carpathia was many hours away. The Titanic had much less time. Another ship, the SS Californian, was nearby, but its wireless operator had stopped listening for the night after an earlier dispute involving wireless messages. The Californian's crew later reported seeing rockets fired from Titanic. The ship did not immediately understand that Titanic was in serious distress. This became one of the most controversial aspects of the disaster. Meanwhile, the situation aboard Titanic was worsening. The bow was sinking deeper into the water. As more compartments flooded, the ship's forward section became heavier. Water continued to move through the damaged areas. The stern gradually rose. Passengers could now see that something was seriously wrong. The ship's lights remained on. Music continued to be played by the ship's musicians. The musicians became one of the most remembered groups from the disaster. They played during the evacuation, helping maintain calm among passengers. Their exact final songs remained debated, but their courage became legendary. As the night progressed, Titanic's bow sank farther beneath the surface. The angle of the ship became increasingly noticeable. Passengers struggled to walk across the decks. Objects began sliding. Furniture moved. People fell. The atmosphere changed from confusion to fear. More lifeboats were launched, but many still departed without being completely filled. This was partly because crew members were uncertain about the boat's actual capacity, and partly because passengers were reluctant to leave. There was also confusion over whether women and children should be strictly prioritized, or whether men could enter once no women were waiting. Different officers interpreted the instructions differently. Eventually, the number of available lifeboats became smaller and smaller. By around 1:30 a.m., the seriousness of the situation was obvious. The Titanic was sinking. The ship's wireless messages became increasingly desperate. Jack Phillips continued sending distress signals. He worked until the final stages of the disaster. The Titanic's nearby ships were trying to respond, but the distance and darkness made rescue difficult. At approximately 2 a.m., almost all the lifeboats had been launched. Hundreds of people remained aboard. The bow was now dramatically submerged. The stern rose higher above the ocean. The ship's enormous propellers became visible. Passengers began realizing there would not be enough lifeboats. Fear spread across the decks. Some people prayed. Others searched desperately for family members. Crew members tried to maintain order. The ship's band continued playing. The last lifeboats were launched. One of the final collapsible boats was difficult to launch properly and eventually floated free as the ship sank. By approximately 2:15 a.m., the situation had become desperate. Titanic's stern rose dramatically. The ship's structure was under enormous stress. The enormous steel hull had been designed to support itself horizontally in the water. Now the bow was underwater, while the stern remained above the surface. The weight distribution became increasingly unstable. Then the ship began to break apart. At approximately 2:18 a.m., Titanic's lights went out. For a moment, the enormous ship stood almost completely dark against the night sky. Then the hull separated. The bow section plunged into the Atlantic. The stern rose even higher. Eventually, the stern also disappeared beneath the surface. At approximately 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912, Titanic was gone. More than 1,500 people had died. Around 700 survivors remained in lifeboats scattered across the freezing ocean. The sea became strangely quiet. The great ship that had been filled with thousands of people only minutes earlier was now resting thousands of meters below the surface. The survivors faced another terrifying challenge. They were surrounded by darkness. The temperature was near freezing. Many people were exhausted. Some lifeboats were overcrowded. Others were damaged. Some survivors could hear cries from people in the water, but there was little they could do. If they returned immediately, they risked being overwhelmed by desperate swimmers. Many survivors later described the sounds of people calling for help. Gradually, those voices disappeared. The lifeboats drifted through the darkness. Hours passed. Then, in the distance, a light appeared. It was the RMS Carpathia. Captain Rostron had pushed the ship through dangerous waters at high speed. The crew prepared to rescue the survivors. At approximately 4 a.m., Carpathia began picking people up. One by one, exhausted survivors were lifted aboard. Some had lost husbands, wives, children, parents, friends. Others had survived while entire families disappeared. The emotional scene was devastating. When the final survivors were rescued, Carpathia continued toward New York. News of the disaster spread rapidly. At first, newspapers reported conflicting information. Some claimed Titanic was still afloat. Others announced that the ship had sunk. The public struggled to understand what had happened. Titanic had been one of the greatest engineering achievements of its time. Now it had become the site of one of the deadliest maritime disasters in history. When Carpathia arrived in New York on April 18, 1912, enormous crowds gathered. Families waited desperately for news. Some hoped their loved ones were among the survivors. Others received devastating confirmation that they had died. The Titanic disaster shocked the world. People asked the same questions. How could such a massive ship sink? Why were there not enough lifeboats? Why did Titanic continue at high speed despite ice warnings? Why did so many lifeboats leave with empty seats? Why did the nearby Californian fail to respond immediately? And most importantly, could the disaster have been prevented? Investigations began almost immediately. Both the United States and Britain conducted official inquiries. The investigations examined the ship's design, crew decisions, wireless communications, lifeboat capacity, iceberg warnings, and emergency response. The disaster changed maritime safety forever. One of the most important consequences was the creation of stricter international safety standards. Ships were required to carry enough lifeboat capacity for everyone aboard. Continuous wireless radio watches became more important. Emergency procedures were improved. Ice patrols were established in the North Atlantic shipping routes. The International Ice Patrol continues monitoring icebergs in the North Atlantic shipping routes today. Titanic's tragedy therefore transformed the future of ocean travel. But the story did not end with the sinking. For decades, Titanic remained hidden beneath the Atlantic. People searched for the wreck. Many believed it might never be found. Then, more than 73 years after the disaster, an expedition led by Robert Ballard and Jean-Louis Michel discovered the wreck in 1985. Titanic was lying approximately 12,400 feet, or about 3,800 meters, beneath the surface. The discovery revealed that the ship had broken into two major sections. The wreck was surrounded by debris scattered across the ocean floor. The discovery finally allowed scientists and historians to study the physical remains of the disaster. Yet even after the wreck was found, many questions remained. Why did the ship's steel fail the way it did? How exactly did the collision damage the hull? Why were the lookouts unable to see the iceberg sooner? Why did the crew respond as they did? And most importantly, what happened during Titanic's final minutes? The answers have become clearer over time, but Titanic continues to fascinate the world because it represents something larger than a shipwreck. It represents ambition, technology, human error, class differences, courage, tragedy, and the limits of human confidence. The ship was built to demonstrate what humanity could accomplish. Instead, its sinking demonstrated something equally important. No matter how advanced our technology becomes, nature remains powerful, and sometimes a single decision made in a few seconds can change history forever. Titanic's story did not end when the ship disappeared beneath the Atlantic. In many ways, that was only the beginning of its journey into history. The disaster shocked the world because Titanic represented the confidence of an entire era. At the beginning of the 20th century, industrial progress seemed unstoppable. Engineers were building taller buildings, faster trains, larger factories, and more powerful machines. Titanic was a perfect symbol of that confidence. She was enormous. She was technologically advanced. She was luxurious. And many people believed that modern engineering had made a disaster of this scale almost impossible. Then, in the early hours of April 15, 1912, that confidence was shattered. More than 1,500 people died. The victims came from different social classes in different countries. Some were among the richest people on Earth. Others were immigrants hoping to build a better future. Some were experienced sailors. Others had never traveled across the Atlantic before. Their lives were completely different, but the disaster brought them together in one tragic moment. After Titanic sank, governments immediately began asking how such a disaster could happen. The British and American investigations examined almost every aspect of the voyage. They questioned surviving officers and crew members. They examined wireless messages. They investigated the iceberg warnings. They studied the lifeboats. They looked at the actions of Captain Smith and the other officers. One of the biggest questions concerned Titanic's speed. The ship had received several warnings about ice in the area, yet Titanic continued traveling at a relatively high speed. At the time, maintaining speed was not necessarily considered reckless by maritime standards. Captains had encountered ice before. But in hindsight, the decision became one of the most important factors in the disaster. If Titanic had been traveling more slowly, the crew might have had more time to react. Perhaps the iceberg would have been spotted earlier. Perhaps the ship would have avoided the collision. But history does not provide a second chance. Another major problem was the lifeboat system. Titanic carried 20 lifeboats, enough for roughly half of the people aboard. This was technically above the legal requirement of the time, but the law itself was outdated. It was based largely on a ship's tonnage rather than the number of passengers and crew. Titanic was so large that the existing regulations did not require enough lifeboats. The disaster demonstrated the terrible consequences of this outdated system. After Titanic, maritime safety regulations changed dramatically. Ships were required to carry sufficient lifeboat capacity. Emergency drills became more important. Wireless operators were required to maintain continuous watches. International agreements were strengthened. The North Atlantic also received a permanent ice monitoring system. The International Ice Patrol was established to track dangerous icebergs and warn ships. These changes saved lives in the decades that followed. Titanic's tragedy therefore influenced the entire future of maritime transportation. But another issue became equally important. The disaster exposed the difference between technological confidence and actual safety. A ship can be enormous and still be vulnerable. A machine can be advanced and still fail. A crew can be experienced and still make mistakes. Technology reduces risk. It does not eliminate it. This lesson remains relevant today. More than 70 years after Titanic sank, scientists finally located the wreck. In 1985, a joint American-French expedition led by Robert Ballard and Jean-Louis Michel discovered Titanic, approximately 3,800 meters beneath the North Atlantic. The discovery was extraordinary. For decades, Titanic's exact resting place had remained unknown. Now cameras could finally see the ship again. But what they found was heartbreaking. Titanic was lying broken across the ocean floor. The bow remained relatively recognizable. The stern was severely damaged. Thousands of objects were scattered across the seabed: pieces of furniture, personal belongings, pieces of the ship's structure. The debris field told the story of the final moments. The wreck also helped scientists understand how Titanic had broken apart. It provided physical evidence that could be compared with survivor testimony and historical records. The discovery transformed Titanic research. It also created a new debate. Should people recover objects from the wreck? Some argued that artifacts should be preserved so future generations could study them. Others argued that Titanic should be treated as a maritime grave. The wreck contains the remains of people who died during the disaster. For many families and historians, it is therefore a memorial rather than simply an archaeological site. Over the years, numerous expeditions have visited Titanic. Some have recovered artifacts. Others have photographed and mapped the wreck. Modern technology has allowed scientists to create detailed digital models of the ship. These models provide a remarkable view of Titanic without requiring people to physically disturb the wreck. But time is slowly changing the ship. The underwater environment is destroying the steel. Microorganisms consume the metal. Parts of the wreck have collapsed. Structures that were once recognizable are gradually disappearing. One day, much of Titanic may be gone. Only scattered pieces may remain. Yet the story itself will survive. Titanic has become one of the most recognizable names in history. Books have been written about the disaster. Documentaries have explored its final hours. Museums display artifacts. Memorials honor the victims. And the story has been retold in films for generations. The most famous modern portrayal came with James Cameron's 1997 film, Titanic, which introduced the story to a new generation. Although the movie includes fictional characters and dramatized events, it brought enormous attention to the historical disaster. People around the world became interested in the real passengers and crew. They learned about the actual ship. They learned about the evacuation. And many began asking the same question: what would it have been like to stand aboard Titanic on that final night? Imagine the scene. The Atlantic is almost completely dark. The sea is unusually calm. The temperature is freezing. Inside the ship, thousands of people are sleeping, dining, talking, or preparing for another day. Outside, lookouts are scanning the horizon. Somewhere ahead lies a massive iceberg. No one knows that history is about to change. Then comes the warning. The ship turns. The iceberg passes along the starboard side. There's a scraping sound. At first, only a few people realize what has happened. Then, water begins entering the ship. Within minutes, the crew understands that the situation is serious. And within hours, the largest ship many people had ever seen disappears beneath the ocean. The tragedy was not caused by one single mistake. It was the result of many factors coming together: ice warnings, high speed, limited visibility, the limitations of the ship's design, insufficient lifeboats, human hesitation, communication difficulties, and the enormous distance between Titanic and potential rescuers. Each factor mattered. Together, they created a catastrophe. That's one reason Titanic remains so important to historians. It demonstrates how disasters rarely have one simple cause. They are often chains of events. One decision leads to another. One problem combines with another, and eventually the system fails. But Titanic is not only a story of failure, it is also a story of courage. Many crew members remained at their posts while the ship sank. Engineers continued working to keep the lights and pumps operating. Wireless operators continued sending distress signals. Lifeboat crews returned to help survivors. Passengers helped strangers. Some people gave up places in lifeboats. Others stayed with loved ones, even when they knew they might not survive. Among the most remembered stories is that of Isidore and Ida Strauss. Isidore was offered a place in a lifeboat because of his age, but he reportedly refused while women and children remained aboard.
Ida refused to leave him. The couple chose to remain together. Their story became one of the most enduring symbols of Titanic's human tragedy. There were many similar acts of sacrifice that night. Not every story is perfectly documented, but the evidence clearly shows that courage existed alongside fear and confusion. The Titanic disaster also revealed the importance of social class. First-class passengers generally had better access to the upper decks in lifeboats. Third-class passengers faced greater difficulties reaching the boat deck. Language barriers, unfamiliar surroundings, locked or restricted passageways, and confusion contributed to delays. Although the idea that third-class passengers were simply locked below is an oversimplification, their chances of reaching the lifeboats were generally worse. The disaster therefore became a powerful symbol of inequality. Rich and poor were aboard the same ship, but they did not experience the emergency in exactly the same way. Titanic's story also changed how people thought about safety. Before the disaster, confidence in technology was extremely high. Afterward, people became more aware of the dangers hidden beneath impressive engineering. The Titanic taught the world a painful lesson. Being advanced does not mean being invulnerable. Today, modern ships carry sophisticated navigation systems, satellite communications, radar, emergency beacons, and advanced weather information. They are monitored constantly. Icebergs in major shipping routes are tracked. International safety regulations are far stricter than they were in 1912. The world learned from Titanic. But perhaps the greatest lesson is not about ships. It is about humanity. We build, we innovate, we become confident, and sometimes that confidence can become complacency. Titanic reminds us that every achievement has limits. Nature does not care how expensive a ship is. An iceberg does not care how famous its passengers are. The ocean does not care how advanced the technology is. The laws of physics remain the same. More than a century later, Titanic still rests in darkness. The once magnificent ship is slowly disappearing into the seabed. But the people who sailed aboard her have become part of history. Their names, their journeys, their decisions, and their final moments continue to be studied. Titanic was supposed to represent the future. Instead, it became a warning from the past, a warning about overconfidence, a warning about inadequate preparation, a warning about the importance of communication and emergency planning, and, above all, a reminder that behind every historical disaster are real human beings. The Titanic was not simply a ship that sank. It was a floating city carrying thousands of dreams. Some passengers were traveling towards wealth, some towards family, some towards freedom, some towards a completely new life. They believed they were beginning a journey. Instead, They became part of one of the most famous stories ever told. On the night of April 14th, 1912, Titanic sailed into the darkness. By the morning of April 15th, she was gone. But her story never disappeared. It crossed generations, it crossed oceans, and more than a century later, the name Titanic still reminds the world of the moment when human ambition met the unstoppable power of nature. And perhaps that is why the Titanic continues to fascinate us. Because it was not merely a story about how a ship sank. It was a story about how people lived, dreamed, loved, struggled, made decisions, and faced the unimaginable. The ship disappeared beneath the Atlantic, but its memory will remain above the surface for generations to come.